Good afternoon. I'm
Yep.
Santa Ono, President and Vice Chancellor of the University of British Columbia. I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Musqueam peoples. I would like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. On behalf of UBC, I'd like to welcome our virtual guests, students, staff, alumni, and community friends. I'd also like to welcome our moderator, Kathryn Gretsinger, and our panelists, Sherisse Pham, Nathan Vanderklip, Emily Rauhala, and Joanna Chiu, four proud Canadian journalists, two of whom are UBC alumni. I wish we could be gathered here in person, but of course the pandemic has made that impossible. I'd like to thank the alumni and staff from the Department of Asian Studies and the School of Journalism who have made this virtual event happen. In closing, I'd like to encourage those of you who are considering a career in the world of journalism. Today, more than ever before, the public needs to hear from reliable voices and sources. I wish you all the best for today's session and in the future. Stay well and to Amen.
Terrific. Thank you. Kathryn, I'll let you go ahead now to welcome our panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thanks to Santa Ono for that introduction. Just in case people didn't feel on the spot already coming into this webinar, now you're really going to be on the spot because we're going to talk about the importance of journalism, especially at this challenging stage in all of our lives. It's wonderful to be able to collaborate with Asian Studies. We're right across the street at the School of Journalism, Writing and Media at the University of British Columbia. And it's a real honor for me to work with my colleagues from Asian Studies and also to welcome our four exceptional guests today. We're going to be talking about career insights, uncovering journalism in Asia. And we have four guest speakers. I'll introduce each of them briefly and say hi, and then we're going to have a conversation together. And we'll try to knit in as many of the questions as we can, the ones that have come from students and other people participating from all over the world, really, sending in questions and wanting to pick the brains of today's expert panelists. I'm going to begin with Sherisse Pham. Sherisse is a reporter with CNN Hong Kong, and she is a UBC alumnus. Sherisse is a tech and business reporter at CNN Business and at CNN International, based in Hong Kong. She's the recipient of the Royal Television Society's Breaking News Award for the CNN news coverage team of the storming the Hong Kong legislature protests that happened earlier on. Prior to being in Hong Kong, she was in Washington, D.C., where she was a general assignment and weekend correspondent and also a digital producer. And she's also worked as a correspondent in London with CNN International. She's covered the Syrian refugee crisis, and in other regional stories in and around Europe, you will have seen her byline. So Sherisse, thank you very much for saying yes to us and joining today's panel.
Thank you, a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. Nathan Vanderklip is a reporter with the Globe Mail. He is based in Beijing. He's been a correspondent in Beijing for some time. His reporting takes place right across Asia. He covers political developments, social trends, international affairs, the refugee crises, and also natural disasters. He has served multiple terms on the board of the Foreign Correspondents Club of China, including as its president. And prior to joining the Globe back in 2009, he was a print and TV correspondent in Western Canada, based in Calgary, Vancouver, and also in Yellowknife. He's covered Canada's energy industry, Indigenous issues, and Canada's North. Please welcome Nathan Vanderklip. Hi, Nathan.
Nice to be here. Thank you.
Great to have you. Emily Rahala is a staff writer at the Washington Post. She covers foreign affairs with the Post, and in a decade of reporting in East and Southeast Asia, she has covered China's rise on the world stage and its authoritarian turn here at home, and there at home, I should say. In 2017, she started the Overseas Press Club, an award for a series that she won on the internet in China. And her work has also been recognized by the Human Rights Press Awards, the Society of Publishers in Asia, and the International China Journalists Association. And she's a graduate at Queen's University, and she also attended the University of Toronto and Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. Welcome to Emily.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being there. And finally, the person closest to home. Joanna Chiu is just down the road from where I sit today. She's a senior journalist with the Toronto Star, also a UBC alum. She works for the Star and has done for some time. She works, of course, for Canada's highest circulation newspaper, the mighty Toronto Star. She's previously served as bureau chief and managing editor at the Star here in Vancouver. Her specialty is China-Canada relations, as well as topics related to race and inequality. She has been based, and she was based for 7 years as a correspondent in China. She reported also for Agence France Presse, covering Chinese politics, legal affairs, and human rights issues. And she's also worked as a correspondent for a news operation in Germany. She has also worked for the South China Morning Post, The Economist, and the Associated Press. So thank you so much for joining us as well, Joanna.
Hey, everyone.
So we have many students joining us today, and we polled them to try to find out some of the things that they were the most interested in. And they seem very hungry to know how to get a start in journalism. So I thought it would be appropriate to ask each of you to give us a very brief origin story. How did you become a journalist, and how did you choose to focus on Asia? So I'll start with you, Sherisse.
Hi. Yeah, so I had a bit of a circuitous route to journalism. I'm sure like many grads out there, when I left UBC, I didn't know what I wanted to do with my English literature degree. I knew I probably did not want to be a teacher, be a pretty horrible teacher, lifelong anyway. And I had an English lit and a commerce degree. And, I took it and I went to Taiwan and I started to teach English, because that seems to be the best thing that you can do with that. And I was there in Taiwan for about 2 years and realized that I didn't want to be doing that for too much longer. So I picked up my bags and I moved to Beijing. And kind of hodgepodge around Beijing, which you could do back then in 2004 on a tourist visa, and somehow landed myself into the Canadian Embassy, where I worked as a visa officer. That's where I met Richard. That's how I met Richard, actually, back in the day in Beijing. And then very slowly, as I was hanging out with the amazing expat community in Beijing, I realized that the coolest people at the parties were either journalists or diplomats. And some NGO workers. I knew I could not be an NGO worker. I knew I definitely couldn't be a diplomat, too blunt. So I thought I'd try my hand in journalism. I started getting a couple articles into alt weeklies. So that's Beijing. Back in the day, I think it paid 3 kwai a word, which is about 25 cents a word, 15 cents a word. And then, the amazing thing about the journalism community is it's super supportive. So I had friends who worked at the Washington Post, Maureen Fan back in the day, and friends at the Wall Street Journal, friends at Bloomberg. And they're like, yeah, you should definitely join. You should definitely join this industry. It's heartbreaking, but you'll love it. And they helped me get my start. They sent, if somebody that they knew in the industry needed a freelancer, or they needed a stringer to do something, they would send me work, and then I would pitch my heart out. I actually remember sending cold an article to the Globe and Mail, and very nicely the editor said thanks but no thanks. But that's the biggest thing I would say for getting your start in journalism. One, you have to be ready to pitch your heart out on stories all the time, and you really have to be ready for rejection. A lot of rejection. But then you'll break through eventually. And hopefully you'll be able to kind of scrounge up a living at the same time. When I was living in Beijing, I kind of hung on to my visa officer job at the Canadian Embassy until I had enough freelance work that I could live on it, which wasn't much at the time. I think I went full-time freelance in 2007, and I lived in Beijing from 2004 to 2009, and then left for Columbia, and then did a career in the US from there.
Right.
And that's the short version. But my start in Asia was very much by luck and by happenstance. And I was in the US, I was in New York for a while, obviously for grad school for Columbia. And then I went to Washington, DC to work for ABC News and CNN. And I loved it. I mean, the US was a special place, but I always knew that Asia was somewhere I wanted to get back to. It was very clear that it was a very important story. It was driving the conversations even in DC. It's a global leader when it comes to any news stories. So I've been back here for about 4 years.
All right, we'll double back and talk a little bit more about your work in Asia. Nathan, what about Sherisse's story is ringing bells for you?
Well, I think, and I know Emily and Joanna as well, I think probably the one thread line through all of our different stories is that I think we've all been willing to sort of leave home and sort of take opportunities as they presented themselves. So for me, it meant sort of going first to Yellowknife, actually. I had, after graduating college, I sort of just started sending out resumes to newspapers, and sorry about the Globe Mail rejection, Sherisse. I seem to remember sending out resumes. So I just cold emailed resumes to like 130 different newspapers across Canada, and ended up getting a job at a small newspaper in Yellowknife. I worked there for a year, and then got hired by Ken West Global Television. I'd never done television before, but the powers that be there decided that it would be easier to teach somebody to do television than to convince somebody from elsewhere in Canada to move to Yellowknife. So I worked for Ken West Global TV as their northern correspondent for a few years, just covering sort of basically the Arctic and the subarctic. And then ended up working for the Financial Post in Vancouver for a couple of years, and got hired by the Globe to cover the energy sector out of Calgary. And I'd always wanted to go overseas. And in fact, my first conversation with the Globe was with John Stackhouse, who was then the editor of the ROB, who hired me. And of course, he had a long and storied career as a foreign correspondent. And so I told him right away that this is what I'd wanted to do. And I think somehow that stuck with him. And the opportunity came up to come to China. And that was shortly after there had been some substantial investments from Chinese SOEs into the Canadian energy sector. So they thought perhaps there might be some value having somebody with that experience in Beijing. There's subsequently been almost no Chinese investments in the Canadian energy sector, but I'm here.
It was a good idea, though.
It worked well for me. And yeah, so I've been here for coming on 7 years now.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the sort of daily grind of reporting in Beijing. Emily, you were smiling at so many points during both of the first two stories. What are you thinking about?
Yeah, I was reflecting how when I was a student, I felt like everyone had a plan except for me, and I didn't know what I was doing. And on the extent to which my career path has been, a little bit of chance and luck, and as Nathan said, going where the opportunity is and running with it. I came to journalism via academia. I thought I wanted to be a professor, and was at U of T doing an MA PhD program. Decided I didn't want to do that. Went to journalism school and thought I would return to Canada. Actually, I did a summer internship at the Ottawa Citizen, and at the end, as Sherisse said, there's lots of rejection. They said, sorry, like, we don't have a job for you. I guess you're not very good. Well, they didn't say that, but that's how it felt. I was unemployed for a few months in Toronto, literally living in my mom's basement, and applied to just every job on the internet. I didn't have a family connection to Asia or language skills, but I, at the time, had done some web journalism training and used that to get in as a web producer at Time Magazine's Asia office as an intern. Really liked Hong Kong, so I stayed around and was again like a homepage producer for a couple of years, wanting to write and report and just kind of doing it on weekends and in my spare time. Still wanted to be a reporter, so I freelanced for a couple of years until I think finally 5 years into my career was able to get a staff job and a salary and healthcare. So yeah, breaking in was an adventure. highs and lows, and happy to, answer questions about freelancing or, moving overseas.
Okay, terrific. Thank you so much. Okay, Joanna, these are sort of three of the kinds of stories that you hear from journalists coming into the business. So it's interesting to hear them. So what is your origin story in journalism?
So I might be a little bit different because I think pretty early on, it was pretty clear I had two very obvious passions. Like one was writing, wanted to be a journalist, and one was China, really interested in modern China. So in high school, I was chatting with journalists and I was like, how should I get into the industry? Like, help me. I have no idea. Cause you can't really, there wasn't that much you can search on the internet back in the day. So I was just like talking to people for advice. And one journalist said that she thinks it better to really pursue your interests in undergrad. So you have an area of specialty, you have a niche and kind of something different to write about. And then, get your journalism skills later. So at UBC, I was very lucky to be free to just explore my interests, and it ended up being just as I was a history major and I took a lot of Asian studies courses, and they were by far the most fascinating out of any courses I took. So after that, having, lucky enough to have parental support to continue my education and to work for free, I did an internship in New York at a magazine and spent, like Emily, spent a year doing my master's at Columbia in journalism, with a goal of focusing on foreign reporting so that I would go overseas. So after J school, this was like 2 years, right, of not really making much money. After graduating from an Ivy League university, I got another internship where I was paid like $500 a month or something for like 4 months in the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. But at least it got me to China, which was where I wanted to be, Greater China. So in an internship, I like worked my ass off and signed up for like midnight shifts, like 4 a.m. random assignments, going to Wan Chai at a bar district to talk to people watching football drunkenly, like all of the really glamorous assignments I signed up for. So luckily after that, they're like, okay, we'll give her a job. So I got a staff job at the newspaper. It was a very interesting time in Hong Kong. Near the end of my time, it was when the umbrella movement, democracy protests happened. And by that time I was freelance actually, because I wanted to transition to freelance so I could transition to moving to mainland China, which was my dream. And it was a great time to be a freelancer. It was so much demand. The whole world wanted to know about the area. So I was very busy. Actually, I had more freelance work than I could handle. I would like stay up all night, like trying to do it all, but I just had to reject some jobs at the end. And that persisted as I went to China, first as a correspondent for Deutsche Presseagentur, a German-owned news agency, which also had an English language component. And it was a bit unusual because I had both like a daily job as a news agency writer, as well as the flexibility to freelance. So it was really busy, but I got to really explore my interests when I was living in China. I could write about all sorts of things. And it was really tough to leave after 4 years in Beijing, 3 years in Hong Kong, because you just don't run out of ideas in China. I just really wanted to stay for like years and years, and just to do everything. But also my family's here in Canada. But surprisingly, when I moved back to Vancouver, China ended up being the biggest story in Canada. So I spent the last 2 years writing about China almost like every week, if not every day. Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou was arrested right in my backyard, Vancouver Airport. So that was definitely relevant. So I would also have a message if you're interested in foreign policy, overseas experiences. You can do it from anywhere because the world is so connected. And I think there's an absence of journalists who are really interested in different countries' foreign relations. So there's a lot of opportunity.
Right, that you can kind of create for yourself. Did all of you early on determine that you had a particular interest in Asia, Asian studies, politics in Asia, or has this been sort of an organic thing for you to sort of gravitate back to coverage of Asian stories and stories in parts of Asia? Nathan, maybe you want to touch on this one first.
Yeah, well, I studied French at university, so but in fact, I got early on in 2008. The Asia Pacific Foundation has a journalism fellowship program where they provide some funding for journalists to come to China. So I actually came to China in 2008 after the Olympics on a reporting trip, for the Financial Post at the time, and so I'd come here then. But I think as China's prominence in the world has changed, I think, you know, its desirability as a place to do journalism has also changed. And I think, you know, I probably, there was a time maybe 10, 20 years ago where you might set as your ambition to be in Washington, as a Canadian anyways, to be in Washington or London. And I think you definitely want to add Beijing to that list these days.
Right, right. Do you miss it, Joanna, being over in Asia and now that you're here and set down roots in Canada again?
For sure. Especially with what's happening in Hong Kong, which was my birthplace, where my family is, looking at how things are really not doing well there. I kind of want to be there to witness and write about it, but I also think it's important to have journalists all over the world trying to monitor, because the role of gathering news is becoming more and more precarious inside China. So we have to find ways for journalists outside the region to have skills, contacts, resources to report from outside, and for news outlets to support their correspondents who are still on the ground there, who aren't kicked out yet. Yeah, but I do miss it a lot, and I worry that I might not get a visa to go to China again, or be blocked from entering Hong Kong, or be careful about what I'm saying in Hong Kong, having been born there. I think what's unique about being a Chinese Canadian journalist is that the Beijing government will treat you like a Chinese person. You will walk around and you won't be treated like a Canadian. They basically will consider all ethnic Chinese kind of de facto Chinese. So there's pros and cons. I felt like I got an insider's view of China, like I was able to build trust with my sources a lot quicker. But also there might be a higher risk there, especially as things are getting more and more just dicey.
Mm-hmm. How are you finding it now, Sherisse, given there's been so much tumult in the last year or two, particularly in Hong Kong?
You know, when I first took on the assignment to come to Hong Kong, I thought this could be great. It's going to be like China Light. That's what I call Hong Kong. You know, after 4.5 years in Beijing, you know, where I literally would get that knock at the door like, oh, hi, what are you doing here? And who are you? And how do you know my name? Why are you asking about journalism? Which I'm sure Nathan gets all the time. But it's been a real fortuitous time, actually, if you're a journalist. I think you know, I cover tech and business, so I do spend a lot of time hanging out with bankers and lawyers now on my beat. And you know, that industry is under pressure because they're kind of like, oh, well, no, people don't want to move here anymore. People are going to leave because Hong Kong has become, you know, insert whatever adjective you want here. But for a journalist, there is no better time to be in Hong Kong. This has been amazing, right? You know, the umbrella movement happened before I got here. But very soon, two years into my stint here, and we had these incredible protests over the extradition law, which, you know, kind of snowballed into more. And then we have the NSL law that's happening now. So there's no better time to be a journalist in Hong Kong. I think, you know, I relish it. It's amazing.
Right. Emily, it must be somewhat discombobulating to be covering Asia in Washington at this time, given the antics and the dramatic politics that are underway in Washington.
That's definitely true. You know, I spent all told between 5.5 years in Hong Kong and then 5 and a bit years in Beijing. You know, many years in that part of the world. And when I left Beijing just under 2 years ago, I thought, you know, new country, new city, new story. And it's sort of like Joanna, almost right away, my new world and my old world were colliding, both because of the surprise detention of the Michaels, the two Canadians, and also because of where the US-China relationship has gone over the last 2 years. And yeah, far from moving on to a new story, covering China and covering China's place in the world, Chinese foreign policy, has become central to what I do as sort of more of a general interest reporter in DC as well.
Right. One of the questions that came up again and again with the students is, what do you do day to day? They want to know nitty gritty kinds of questions. So given the geography alone, not to mention the politics, the people, the cultures that you'd be covering Asia, what do you read? What does your routine look like? They want to know. How do you file? How many hours a day do you put in? How do you keep up the pace? Where do you get your sources? Where do your story ideas come from? How do you know what to pitch? So who wants to tackle that tidy little question? Maybe a couple of tips from each of you about how you try to keep track of all of this. Sherisse, do you want to go first?
Sure. So I work for a huge, sprawling American network. It's lovely. I love it. And CNN is amazing, because I think CNN folks might be listening into this panel right now. But I will say, when you are with a bigger organization, it ends up being a little bit of both. Pitching is still very important, but you also get assignments, because content is king, right? Because we all live in the digital internet era as well, and the internet is a hungry beast. So there are days when you might pitch something in the morning and the editor's like, great, that's wonderful, I'll clear your deck, you can do it. And then something happens in the middle of the day, like TikTok CEO quits, and then whatever you were working on completely gets shelved, and all you're doing is digging into this other story and making sure that you can file on it. Often with CNN too, you're filing for multiple platforms, so you're filing something that can live online and be written and is coherent, and then you're also maybe trying to get ready and do a television hit. You guys are seeing me from my beautiful Wanchai studio, which is my apartment these days. And that's actually, I don't know. I wouldn't know. I don't know if it's maybe it's better to be in the bureau, because then you can move from your desk to the studio. But my day-to-day is a little bit like that. It's pitch an assignment and who wins out. And you're always going to be, when you get to a certain level in your career, you're always going to be fighting for that time to work on the meatier pieces, the features, the analysis, the things that will land with a little bit more oomph. And fighting against the daily needs of the hungry content beast. And that's the reality of journalism these days, I would say. So you're going to have that. There's going to be days of pitching and amazing time to work on your features. And there's going to be days when you are just on the hamster wheel covering daily news. But that can be really gratifying too, because turning something quickly and getting it out, and maybe sometimes getting it out ahead of your rivals can also be satisfying.
Right. Emily, you were laughing at one point when Sherisse was speaking. What were you thinking about?
Well, I was thinking about my life back when I was still in Beijing. In terms of the mechanics of what it looks like, I think, as a Beijing correspondent, I was filing maybe 8 to 10 stories a month.
A month? 8 to 10 a month? Yeah,
maybe slightly fewer, depending on the month. Which I think is probably below average for a Beijing-based correspondent. We were splitting up, 1 week you were on news, 1 week you were doing enterprise, so that you could, maybe 2 of those would be enterprise stories, page ones, and then the rest would be just quick hits. The lifestyle when you're on a beat like China can be really fun and intense. I don't think I went to a dinner party without taking my laptop.
You file from the bathroom.
One New Year's Eve, I had been, drinking champagne for 5 hours, and then got asked to file. And there's a picture of me somewhere, at a restaurant with my laptop, just filing like this. And I think I was traveling maybe 40 to 50% of the time for those years. It's not always like that, doing this kind of work. Since I've come back to DC, I'm on a much more enterprise focused arrangement, maybe, 4 or 5 stories a month or fewer if I'm working on something bigger. I think Sherisse really nailed it when she said that, your whole career is just, filing enough news that you can have some time to work on the story the project that you've got in your back pocket. And that really never changes.
We try to tell our students that all the time. You want that to be working on 2 or 3 tracks all at once, so that if you got to turn something around, you got it, but you've also got something smoking hot in the back pocket, to come back to. Nathan, what about you? What's your day-to-day, and how do you make sure that as the Globe and Mail's Beijing correspondent, you're on top of it?
I suppose similar to what Emily was saying, which is you are sort of monitoring news as it's taking place. You're making phone calls. Sometimes things pop up and you work on that. But I really think that Beijing, in my experience anyways, much more than anywhere else I've worked, because the pace of journalism can be so slow, because it's so difficult to actually get things done. It feels like where in most places you might want to have 2 or 3 things on the go. Here you need like 4 or 5 channels that you're all trying to pursue at the same time. And then, eventually something breaks on one of them, and you can finish it and write it up. But I feel like that's a big part of the Beijing experience. In fact, strangely, I find vacations very disrupting, because when you're juggling a whole lot of things and then you kind of walk out of the room, they all fall to the ground. But as far as for me, because I'm here alone and because I am on the exact opposite time zone from our editing staff, often, sometimes, not enough, according to them, I will tell them what I'm working on. But just as often, they'll wake up in the morning and I will have already reported and written and filed a story before my editors have any idea what I'm working on. And I think that's one of the amazing parts of this job, is there's an enormous degree of autonomy, an enormous degree of an ability for me to sort of sort out what is important news and what needs to happen. And it sort of works for our newspaper as a digital product, because our busiest time of day on our website is in the morning. And so if I can file here by early evening, I can get a story up online when we have the most readers on our website. So from that perspective, it can be quite helpful.
Right. Joanna, for you, as somebody who's sort of immersed in Canadian news and trying to sort of situate Asian news within, how do you juggle and balance and make sure that you're staying on top of those big stories and able to knit them in here in Canada?
Well, with the current context, there are so many different Canada-China connections, but the tricky part is to maintain people's interests and also get people to understand like the nuances and also the human experiences of these big geopolitical stories. So I try to tell it through people's stories, such as, say, a person of Chinese descent who's getting intimidated from police in China. Or I recently did an investigative piece about how exactly Chinese government officials or state media might try to court Canadian low-level politicians, such as on a municipal level. Like, we hear about government influence ops, like it sounds very mysterious and what is that? But there's a lot of interest, but the trick here is to try to actually find concrete examples so that people understand what it actually looks like. Because you run into here outside China people who don't really understand just the different actors and what would be exaggerated and what's actually the truth. So just trying to tell these stories in different ways, because you run into, it's a really tricky territory of some people, oh, you're China bashing, this is very negative. So telling in a nuanced way is kind of the biggest challenge for me here in Canada. I also wanted to add, covering China, I work for wire agencies, so I think a lot of people have confusion over what a news agency is or a wire service, but it's actually a really great option if you want to go into journalism. Often these operations are bigger around the world, so there might be more job openings. So in Beijing, I worked for first Deutsche Presse Agentur, the German press agency, and then AFP, Agence France Presse, many languages, and AFP is the third largest news agency in the world. So, thousands of journalists around, filing 24 hours a day, this constantly. So a newswire is basically, so in Canada, I know Emily and Nathan pretty well because we were among like, the three of us were the Canadian journalists in Beijing. And I think Janice in TV, there's like very few, right? Most Canadian media can't afford to get someone to live full time in all over the world. So a lot of media outlets rely on agencies, and that provides everything any outlet might want from a different place. So it might be a breaking news story, or it might be a short feature, or a listicle, or photos. So it's a very fast-paced work environment. So sometimes I would file 4 times a day, or it would be so quick, you would be filing on your phone, and then your editor would be just like slapping it all together and then putting it on the wire so that readers can have it instantly. Because now with online, people want their news now. They don't want to wait for the next day newspaper. By then it's old, so they're looking for analysis for next day. So I would look into what a newswire is to try to see if that could be an option for you, because they're like, say Reuters has a huge office in Beijing, whereas if you're a newspaper correspondent, usually you're one person, so you have to really pick and choose what you're going to cover. Right. Sometimes you take your own photos too. So
what about the challenges that are specific to countries like China with things like censorship and government monitoring and so on? How have each of you contended with some of the challenges of that as you're trying to practice journalism? Nathan, do you want to touch on that one first?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose to start with, none of us who have operated in Beijing have had our content censored. I mean, we all write what we want. The censorship is for content that's published inside China. And so, Sherisse, maybe you encountered some of that when you were working for local media. But for us, publishing abroad, we're not censored. I feel like the censorship affects journalism here in a couple of ways. One, it really affects our ability to learn about what's happening inside China through other media, and that includes social media. Which of course is often a very good window into the world, but here it's carefully managed. And two, it can often affect people's willingness to speak with us. So oftentimes, if you try to speak with anyone with even what might be considered a semi-official position, which of course extends to people who work in with state-owned enterprises, which extends to people who work in academia and that sort of thing. They are anyone with even sort of who is accustomed to working with local media will also be accustomed to, for example, having the ability to sign off on a full article before it's published, and they'll ask you to do the same, which of course is not something we can do. And so it can create obstacles in that way. So I think that's, from a censorship perspective, that's and then of course, I mean, there is a desire by the elements of the Chinese government that are tasked with managing foreign journalists. There's a desire to have us tell the story that they deem to be the story they want to have told. And so when we don't do that, they can, there are journalists who have been put on very short visas. There's obviously been, over the course of this year, a number of journalists have been kicked out of the country. People can be called into the foreign ministry for what can sometimes be uncomfortable conversations. So those are, I would say, the sort of the various elements of that.
Right. Does anyone else want to touch on the question of censorship? I want to make sure that we have time to touch on COVID as well.
Yeah, so I'll touch on that just really quickly. So just to, especially because the my real journalism career in Beijing started right at the end, but it was a very exciting time. It was sort of 2007 to 2009. It was the run up to the Olympics and then the post-Olympic high. And I had to actually go and look it up again. I was 28 when I took my first unpaid internship because I had a fundamental resistance to unpaid internships. I thought it was wrong. I still think it's wrong. I think you deserve to get paid, and I think you should pursue a paid job first if you can. But if you can't, I mean, internships are also a way into the business, and I understand that. And I did it myself as well as an old intern. So I was interning at the CNN bureau in 2007, 2008. And seeing CNN content blacked out regularly as lives would happen. And then a huge kerfuffle happened in 2008, which was a commentator, Jack Cafferty, went on The Situation Room and he called, he was asked about the relationship with China, and he said, I think our relationship with China has certainly changed. I think they're basically the same bunch of goons and thugs they've been for the last 50 years. Of course, as you can imagine, Beijing was furious about this. Obviously that was blacked out, during the airing. But then I just saw our bureau chief, Jimmy Florcruz, hauled into MOFA, coming back looking exhausted, because at that point you're just kind of fighting to protect your bureau, right? You don't want your journalists to get kicked out. You don't want your correspondents to get kicked out. They had to move correspondents and producers to hotels to sort of keep them protected, because also whipping up this anger in China is also a way to foment anger amongst Chinese folks, because they can kind of focus their anger outwards. That was a crazy time. And I think it's important to keep that in context too, as we come to where we are today. This censorship has been long, I think we can all be like, oh my God, China's so crazy right now. And so, the iron fist is coming down. The context has been there for decades. And, now I've come full circle, where I was reporting on, I think something that's mostly innocuous from our perspective, which is that China forced Apple to remove a bunch of VPN apps from its store. Right. And I had a friend who was in Beijing. He's like, hey, I was watching you on CNN and you just got blacked out. And we're like, yeah, point of pride. And, but it is a steady pattern, and it has held. And China has proven that their way of walling off the internet has worked for decades. There is no incentive to change that.
Joanna, Emily,
yeah,
go ahead.
To add something. I think what's really kind of overlooked and invisible to many, people internationally, is that any type of foreign reporting around the world, especially when it's in a language that's not English, involves often local journalists working alongside foreign correspondents. So many bureaus, newspaper correspondents, have Chinese journalists working with them, especially like I studied Mandarin for years, but arriving in Beijing, it was still like, So you're like really very reliant, especially in the first year or two, on your colleagues. But that gets tricky because they're Chinese citizens. And it's hard because every day they're trying to gauge what they're comfortable working on with you. So I think that's gotten worse and worse over the years. Sometimes it's pretty routine for a Chinese foreign ministry official to try to have tea with your Chinese colleague to try to intimidate them, put pressure on them. And some have quit, some think the pressure is not worth like often the quite low pay that news assistants get in comparison to full correspondents. China doesn't allow journalists to actually be journalists for foreign media. They have to be called news assistants. And that in itself kind of puts them in a tricky position where they're news gathering, but they're not treated as journalists and paid like journalists on the most part. Right. So me and some other woman writers, journalists, we started a group called New Voices, nuvoices.com. That's our website, to try to kind of support all sorts of women, because often these local journalists working for foreign media are women journalists, have their voices heard, have their stories published, and to kind of have more diversity in what we see from China reporting. I think we do need to think about local journalists quite a bit when we think about censorship, because the decisions foreign media makes can really impact someone's safety. Maybe even if someone might, be arrested or detained, which has happened in the past. Nathan would know, being involved in Foreign Correspondence Club so long, they gather a lot of data in their yearly survey of press freedoms.
Right. We'll make sure to include information about New Voices in the package when we send out the recording next week. We're going to put together this recording, contact information, so that you can follow all of these journalists on Twitter and follow along with what they're up to. And we'll also make sure that you have contact information for the various associations and certainly for New Voices as well. The organizers are saying that this is going so well, they're wondering if all of you can hang in until 6:15 Pacific time. If we push it for an additional 15 minutes, if people are available to stay, they'd like us to keep going because the conversation's rolling. If that feels Comfortable? Okay, Emily, you've been dying to get in. I'm so sorry. Go right ahead.
Well, I think the point that Joanna made is exactly right. The Chinese government doesn't peer into your file as you're writing and change the words, but are very effective in making it very difficult or very dangerous to do certain types of work. They can be very explicit in their threats to your colleagues who are Chinese nationals. And it's proved a very effective way not to eliminate negative coverage, but to raise the stakes of doing that coverage to the point where people think, do I really want to travel to China's Northwest with my colleagues? And what's so worrying right now is that, the extent to which that's starting to happen in Hong Kong. And if you are an aspiring reporter who's looking to start a career, 5 years ago I would have said, great, show up in Beijing. Exactly like Sherisse said, there's opportunity, there's stories, and the stories are still there, but the logistics of freelancing from the PRC right now are quite daunting, quite dangerous. And I'd say that I'm interested if my co-panelists feel the same way, but at this point I'd say it's probably a good time to look at how you can cover the story from outside of the PRC right now, doing the kind of work that Joanna's doing. There was a big, really impactful BuzzFeed investigation today on Xinjiang, reported again from outside of China, and it's a shame and truly heartbreaking that is the reality right now. But without a journalist visa and some accreditation, it's pretty dangerous.
I did want to touch on this with all of you and the vastness of the Asian Pacific region and the tremendous number of challenges that are underway at the moment. What is your analysis of the kind of coverage that is available? And as Santa Ono said at the top, journalism is important. We need to get facts out, and truth telling is such an important thing, but knowing where to reach. So where do you reach for fact-based information, and how do you know that the sources that you've been able to reach for are still able to function and share in a way that is believable and authentic and verifiable? Sherisse.
My beat is tech and business now, so it does make it just a little bit different than the sort of general news assignment that we were doing back in the day, that I was doing back in the day. But, in Hong Kong during the protests, it's almost like there's a wealth of opportunity to make sources because you're literally standing in a crowd of protesters. So you can just grab anybody to talk to and get a variety of voices that way, and then obviously balance it out by chatting with the other side afterwards. I don't find it to be too difficult. From the business perspective, I will say covering Chinese companies is quite, I'm sure Nathan has experienced this as well. It can be incredibly frustrating because they're often not willing to talk. They don't return phone calls. If they do, they give you I had this happen yesterday with somebody at Alibaba that said, well, I'm not responding, but I'm not responding. I'm kind of like ghosting you, but I didn't want to ghost you because you're a friend. Literally what she texted me in WeChat. And then said it in a voice message. I was just, I don't even know what to go back to my editor and tell her about what you just told me. So I just, I sent her a thumbs up emoji back. I think it's always going to be a challenge. I mean, you have to use your spidey sense at the end of the day, I think is kind of the best way to put it. And then you double check yourself or you get double checked by your editors and your colleagues. And, if you're not sure about something, I would say talk to the veterans in the newsroom and say, hey, look, this is happening. And I don't know, what do you think? And I think sometimes as well as journalists, we can get very focused on the most, certainly in television news, you can get very focused on the most compelling, visually friendly, well-spoken folks on a topic, but they're not always the best people. to speak on that topic. So you have to find a variety of voices and see how you can make that work in your piece. If you're doing it for television, maybe you just paraphrase what they say and you don't put them on air, but you make sure that their voices are included, because it's not all, you know, like it's not all Joshua Wong in Hong Kong. You know, the movement is so much bigger than that. So I think it's important to find a variety. And if they don't work, then I can speak from television. If they don't work for television, find a different way to make it work in your piece. And that's different for print. For print, it's great. Like, you know, you can always clean up a quote and paraphrase so that, you know, the ums and ahs and the broken English isn't so distracting. But it can be a little bit more challenging for television, I'd say that.
Okay, thank you. Nathan, what do you think of the coverage? And then Joanna, then Nathan, who wants to?
I'm going to add another point on safety, because I think this is such an important message, because we don't really want to end up sending someone to China and then, like, you know, getting in trouble. I think young journalists are really hungry. I think journalism programs, internships kind of condition you here in the West to just go for a story no matter what and meet your deadline no matter what. But when you're in like an authoritarian country where a lot of people can literally disappear overnight, Chinese citizens with no access to a lawyer, the families have no idea where they are. I think it's something that you have to go in with such like clear eyes of so much prior research. It's called parachuting. Like, especially for China, I wouldn't recommend trying to parachute in, landing and just running around trying to look for a story, because it's not just about your safety, it's about other people's safety, your sources' safety. So when I try to report on these human rights cases in China, we never used a phone call because people would assume that their phone was tapped, for example. We try to meet in person or to use encrypted apps, but you have to keep track of it all the time, because sometimes one app is working, but one's not working. One's more likely to be monitored by police or not. So there's a lot happening, and I would recommend that to be competent, especially covering like sensitive issues, I would say get your Chinese up to snuff. Invest time, especially if you're in school right now. That's a great time to learn Mandarin while you have time, because that just kind of gives you more familiarity. You won't end up being in a position where you don't know what's going on around you, which can be quite dangerous, because you might not be able to rely on a local colleague to help you in this particular situation, because they might not be comfortable speaking up in a particular situation. So I think especially China, or say any country where there's free speech, press freedom is not secure, like in Canada, just be as prepared as possible and learn the language if possible, so you can be relatively independent and familiar with your surroundings.
Okay, good points. It sounds like we have an additional panel member coming in to hang around with us in the next little bit too. So we might get a special guest appearance soon. Emily, you had made the point earlier about people reporting from a distance now and trying to bring these stories alive, but I suppose those same considerations are at play when you're reaching for sources. Even if you're at a distance, you need to be mindful of the people you're reaching for and the potential consequence of your reporting on their circumstance.
That's exactly right. And you know, Nathan made the point earlier that when you're reporting on or about or in mainland China, everything takes a little bit longer. And just, you know, examples, I wanted to do a piece, I think when I was based in Beijing, on domestic violence. It took me, I think, almost 3 years to find a family that was genuinely willing to talk to me, that truly understood the consequences. I've been doing some reporting from DC on Uyghur asylum seekers in DC. I interviewed multiple families for almost a year before I found a family that I felt truly understood what it meant to speak out, had Chinese documents to be able to independently verify their, you know, property records, flights, passport stamps. Part of doing this kind of credible reporting on the PRC means, you know, it's like you have your daily timeline, your weekly timeline, and then you have these projects that are happening in the background, sometimes over the course of years, until you can find, you know, a source that has the verification that you're looking for. And just one other point I wanted to pivot to as well is that, this, as you said, the Asian Pacific region is really big. And if you're looking to start your career in the region, there are places beyond Beijing that you should consider. If I could go back and be a student right now, I would love to study Korean. That's an amazing story. Southeast Asia, there's still a lot of entire enormous countries that are undercovered. And if any of you are interested in reporting elsewhere in Asia, particularly Southeast Asia, message me, and I have contacts and thoughts there as well.
Oh, that's terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much. Nathan, what are your thoughts on covering and cover edge of the region? What advice would you offer up, and what are your insights that you'd like to share?
Well, I mean, maybe it's obvious now, but it feels to me like if you want to get a toehold in terms of writing about China, I mean, there's much worse places to go to than Taipei, which is a place where you can go to sort of be immersed in a Mandarin environment. It still has close connections to China, and you're obviously in the same time zone. We're actually seeing more and more formerly based in Beijing correspondents heading that way, not by choice, but I think it's proven to be, for Emily's colleagues as well as for others, not a bad base of operations. And it's a very different media environment there. There's other options too. I mean, I agree with Joanna. I think language is very important, and I think what language does is being able to speak enough Chinese to operate as a journalist on your own in China allows you to sort of lessen some of the risks to the people that you work with. So if you are able to go to parts of China where you travel by yourself, even, in my case, when I go to sensitive parts of the country, I rent cars, so I don't even have a driver, so it's just me, and there's no one else who can be a part, I suppose, from the people that you speak with. You have to be very careful with that as well. But then there's nobody else that can sort of face consequences for what they're working with you. And in China, for example, for people, I think it's 35 and under, I mean, there are programs where you come to China and study Chinese for free, actually. The Chinese government offers that. So there are options. There are options there. As far as I think your initial question was, trying to figure out what's true and what's not. I mean, to sort of build on what Emily was saying, in China, you're not only just dealing with a media environment that doesn't tell you everything that's happening and that colors the truth, but also with a government that has shown a willingness to deny what's true. And so that has considerably raised the bar, I think, for journalists to ensure that what we are dealing with, the people we're dealing with, the stories that we are telling, the facts that we're recounting are verifiable in multiple different kinds of ways. But I think one of the things that's perhaps underappreciated, maybe for people who haven't worked in China, is that while you have that, on the other hand, sort of the rise of social media has allowed everyday Chinese to sort of have a voice in a way that we can hear, and that even if stuff is censored, you can screen cap stuff, you can sort of go back to people. Stuff usually exists online, at least briefly, before it's deleted, which can be very helpful. But the other thing is that one of the amazing things that's happened in China in the last 5-10 years is the proliferation of government documents online, and some of the best reporting that's been done in Xinjiang has been going through requests for proposals, bids, and this sort of thing, which is as authentic a document as you're going to get, and sort of the ability to sort of peer through some of those documents, I think, has actually provided a real window into China.
I did want to touch on COVID, as we all are living through this. Now, what have you learned about China through the experience of COVID? Joanna.
I think it's more what I'm learning about people's perceptions of China here in Canada. At my newspaper, I've been covering or tracking incidents of anti-Asian hate crimes, which have just exploded since the pandemic started, because I think a major issue and major challenge and frustration being a journalist covering Asia is that people seem to really struggle to separate people who are of a certain ethnicity or cultural group and the Chinese government. It's like as if you hate Americans because you hate Trump, you know? But it's so common here. And I myself have noticed more incidents of racism and discrimination in the last several years, as distrust and kind of anger towards what the Beijing government is doing has increased here. And that's a disturbing trend, and the pandemic has only made it so much worse. At the same time, I think it's gotten so bad that there is a conversation about, like, this is not acceptable. I can't believe that we could be attacking an old man on the street here in Vancouver, just where I'm here right now in East Vancouver, because of a pandemic starting in, it happened to start in a Chinese city. So that's what I think I'm grappling with when it comes to COVID.
Yeah. Emily?
It's been really interesting. In some ways, the Chinese government's handling of the coronavirus outbreak was highly predictable. I think all of us who covered China for years, as soon as that outbreak happened, anticipated the local government cover-up, anticipated that cover-up moving up through the different levels of government. What's been, more surprising, of course, has been the impact on the rest of the world. And I'm glad Joanna spotlighted the issues of xenophobia and racism, the extent to which that has become prominent in the U.S. debate over the coronavirus, and actual reporting on the coronavirus in the United States is very troubling. And just separately, I think this whole experience has been really interesting from a reporting perspective. Maybe we can pivot to this after, but the way that having everyone at home in their houses has shaped reporting, how you tell stories, not traveling. It's great in terms of like getting US government sources like at their houses. They'll actually pick up their phone because they're not in front of their boss. Everyone's responding to journalist calls, but you can't see them. You can't sit across from them. So it's shaping how we do our work.
Yeah, in so many ways. Yeah. Nathan, did you want to touch on that too, Sherisse?
Yeah, sorry. I'll go ahead if that's okay, Sherisse. I would say a couple of things. One, for me, and people who have perhaps been in China for decades have seen this before, but I hadn't seen it before. One of the most remarkable things was in the early days of the outbreak, it was the first time I had seen such a nationwide sense of rage. And this was particularly after the death of Li Wenliang, the doctor who had sort of exchanged messages in a WeChat group. There was such a sense of rage that it broke through most of the barriers to expressing dissatisfaction with government and that sort of thing. And so you had like people openly, and not just a couple, but large numbers of people openly sort of expressing their unhappiness with censorship. You had some people even sort of going out and saying we need democracy in China and that sort of thing. And you had, for a brief period of time, you had the shackles largely taken off of local journalists. And so it was, there was a week or two where you could read the Chinese press and be like, oh, I feel like I'm starting to understand what's happening here. And it was extraordinary to see that. And then of course that all sort of came down. So, I mean, I think after that, it's been sort of another, I think there is an importance for having representatives of a freer press in China in terms of helping us to understand what's happening here. I mean, you've had a World Health Organization delegation that came to Beijing, spent 3 weeks here and wasn't allowed to go to Wuhan, right? So you have so much control that's being taken place in terms of trying to shape that narrative in China. I think there's value in having other people, sometimes obviously for many reasons, more distance from the culture and that sort of thing, but people with sort of more latitude to be able to try to investigate what's happening and to be able to shed light on some of these things.
Right. Sherisse, did you want to touch on that as well?
Here in Hong Kong, I thought it was really fascinating. Like Nathan, this city has gone through it before, but I wasn't here for it, So when the first news about the virus started trickling out, it was incredible to see how quickly Hong Kong went into lockdown mode. And that was also really fascinating to see as well, because obviously we were in the middle of a protest movement as well that had gathered momentum and speed and was just kind of stopped by this pandemic. So there were two conversations, there are multiple conversations, but two prevalent conversations that were going on in Hong Kong at the time, which was that, one, we all need to hunker down so that this doesn't devastate Hong Kong the same way that SARS did, but also, will this be the end of the protest movement? Because now you can't go out, you can't gather, and the leadership here had a cover for when they said that you cannot go out and gather in large groups. They point to this deadly virus that was circulating. So that's just been interesting to see how that has played out, obviously. And now you've got these sort of conflicting narratives of being grateful for the way that Hong Kong handled the situation, but then you have folks saying it's not because of the government, it's because of the Hong Kong citizens and how well they reacted, because the government had all these conflicting messages, and that continues to play out here today. And that's been really fascinating to watch.
All right, I'm going to bring us full circle and go back to starting a journalism career. Yes or no answer from everyone. Do you need a degree in journalism to get a job as a journalist? Yes or no?
No, but I will say no, but.
Most people are going like this, but there's a little, okay, so that's one. And two is it as difficult always to get a foothold in journalism, or is there something particular, given the economy, given the pandemic, given all of the challenges in journalism right now, is there something particular about this time for people who are deciding whether or not to pursue this career? I'll have each of you.
Unfortunately, I think for this time, the industry has gotten this two-pronged hit, right? On the one hand, at CNN, we've never had more of a higher viewership, and we've never had more of a higher readership online and on TV than we have right now. But advertisers, of course, are not advertising, and it's still very much an advertiser-dependent revenue model. So it's heartbreaking. You know, I think this industry is really tough, and you gotta love it. That's what I'll say about that.
That was a point you made right off the beginning. It's that it's heartbreaking, but you love it. So, Joanna, what about for you? What do you think?
You need to be really passionate about it. You shouldn't be on a fence and then try to be a journalist. It has to be like the only thing that you want to do with your life. And I think if that's the case, then you will find a way. If you get laid off 5 times, I know people who have been laid off 5 times who are successful journalists, really talented, experienced journalists, but it happens. Like, it's still an advertising model. It's hard to get people to pay for subscriptions for so many different outlets. You're going to lose your job most likely. You're going to have to change jobs or might move cities. You might have to pick up a new skill, computer skills or data or coding or investigative skills. So you have to be very flexible. I think it's possible if you really want it. But if you're sitting, picking your major now or deciding whether to do a master's of journalism now and you're not quite sure, or some of this sounds just bad to you, I would say see if you have other passions. Because I remember in some slides that Nathan gave another presentation we were on together, and I don't know, your projections didn't look very good, and that was a few years ago, so I don't know what you would think now about the future of the industry. Definitely possible, but it might not be the job you set out doing. So be flexible. You might end up in radio, TV, all sorts of different types of media and journalism.
Right. Okay. Nathan?
Yeah, I would say, I mean, in answer to the initial question, I don't think you need a degree in journalism. I think there are paths that open up to you if you have a degree in journalism. I mean, that can sort of put you on a path to a newspaper internship, which can put you on a path to a job. But I think I don't think you need it. And I agree with Joanna. I think having a specialty in something else is valuable, both to you as a person and likely to your career at some point in time. I mean, to me, you know, I think for me, it's when I try to contemplate another career that I would like to do, I can't think of anything that sort of offers everything that journalism offers. And it's a difficult career to break into. But I think, you know, if you're the kind of person who is willing to sacrifice some financial security for adventure, for knowledge, for the ability to sort of see things and talk to people and all that sort of thing, which is, you know, the heart of the job, then great. I mean, if you're looking for financial security, I mean, the banks are always hiring.
Emily, how are you going to follow that?
It's true, the banks are hiring, I hear. No. Do you need a degree? I don't think you do, but I will say that it does make it easier. A lot of people will say, oh, you don't need a journalism degree. I didn't go to journalism school. And then you find out that they went to Harvard and both their parents are foreign correspondents. And you're like, oh, okay, well, you know, I do think that definitely not necessary, but it does open doors, and it does, you know, more than the training, it opens doors. You know, it gets you on the path, as Mason said, to those internship interviews, to those first jobs. You know, on the economic question, I graduated, this is gonna age me a little bit, but I graduated in 2007. People were saying, you know, this is the worst time it's ever been for journalism, don't do it. And I really wondered whether I should. I assumed that I would not be successful. I would assume that I would not have a career, that I'd end up doing something else. And, you know, it is possible. So if you really want to do it, you know, give it a go. I do think it's smart, you know, when I talk to people who are wanting to get into the industry, not everyone, but many people want the same path, a general news assignment for a major media outlet. That's not the easiest way into the industry. So I think, as Joanna said as well, you know, do you have a niche skill that is desirable? Right now, if I was starting out, I would be taking data journalism. I would be looking at, you know, what kind of technical skills can I have in terms of understanding algorithms? Like, there's all sorts of technical tech reporting stuff that I would love to be doing right now if I could go back and learn how to build a proper database. And so if you are starting out, you know, do that. That's how you get, you know, the entry level jobs now are in data journalism. They're in covering tech. Language skills are another really good way in. So just think about what skills you have, where your passions lie, and look for an opening. And from there, once you have your foot in the door, you'll have a lot more opportunity to do stories.
I just want to jump in on that too. I would echo that. You know, even when I was starting my journalism career, it was a big like, oh, if you have online skills, you'll be really hireable. And that just meant that if you knew how Twitter worked, you could probably get a job in journalism. And it was true. And now you've got this, if you have skills in data journalism, you could be worth your weight in gold for almost any major media organization. And if you want to get your start in that, there are great fellowships for that. So you don't even have to do an unpaid internship to learn how to do that. There are organizations out there that will pay you to learn it so that you can get placed at a major media organization or even a smaller media organization that needs good people to do that work. And that work is just so compelling and so interesting. I'm too old to learn it now. And I also wanted to just really quickly touch on what Joanna said. I mean, I agree that you got to have a fire in the belly to do journalism. And I've also said that the industry can be difficult. But I will say, especially now that I cover business, the things that have happened in the journalism industry happen with every industry. You have to learn new tricks or you'll get outdated. You may get laid off multiple times, and like the industry will change and you'll have to change with it. That is not just something that's only journalism. That also happens to the bankers. So, they just made more money before they got fired, but they probably spent it on wine and good food. So don't let that also keep you back from pursuing something in journalism. You can find ways to, I'm a huge proponent of getting paid for journalism. I do not advocate free internships, and there are organizations that have paid internships. So just keep knocking on those doors. And like Emily said, once you have your foot in the door, you can blast it open.
Right. Well, I think we'll leave on that note of blasting it open. I know we've had more than 100 attendees, and this has been recorded and it's going to be shared at journalism schools and beyond. I'm so grateful to all of you for taking this time. Thank you so much for your generosity and your wisdom. And I look forward to our paths crossing again. Thank you all so very much. Sherisse Pham, Nathan Vanderklip, Emily Rauhala, and Joanna Chiu. Thank you so much to the Department of Asian Studies at UBC and the School of Journalism, Writing and Media. I'm Kathryn Gretsinger. We really appreciate you participating with us today. Please fill out your survey form and we will send along this recording and a whole bunch of the references that each of our journalists made today sometime next week so that you can have that to look at as you go forward. And for those of you who are looking for a career in journalism, best of luck. Not an easy road, but lots of opportunities are available. Thank you very much for watching.
Beautiful. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Great.
That's fun. It's nice to see you guys.
Oh my gosh, that was so fun. This is my first time meeting a lot of you guys. I know your byline.